Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the Party Pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 151. I'm talking to Christian Heiens, who is the co-host on the Nick Freitas podcast. It's a very interesting channel worth checking out, and he's often got some good insights. We're going to talk about issues facing marriage, divorce, men, the culture of dating and single life, how not to be single, having kids, and how messed up we think it is right now, and possible solutions to the problem. How are you, Christian?
I'm doing well, Chris. How about you?
I'm doing well too. How did you end up in this? As Nick's co-host, is partner in discussion.
So it's a bit of a funny story. I've known Nick for 12, maybe even 13 years at this point. Far longer than he's been an internet celebrity or a social media personality, even longer than he's been a politician, which is something that actually a decent number of people don't know. He's a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. That's what first started all of this, and now he's become a lot more well known for his shorts and his Instagram stuff and YouTube stuff and whatnot. But I first met Nick when I was in high school, actually. And the reason being that Nick was a former Army Ranger, former Special Forces. He was a Green Beret. He did 2 tours in Iraq, and he used to be stationed out in Fort Lewis in Washington. And a couple of his neighbors ended up moving to my little small town in Culpeper, Virginia. And They had a kid that went to high school with me, and we were friends. And then Nick moved to Culpeper many years later in, I think, 2008 or 2009. And he reconnected with his former neighbors, right? They had moved across the country together. And it was because of that connection and the fact that I went to high school with one of the kids in that family that I got to meet Nick. And I met him probably, my sophomore or junior year of high school.
Yeah.
And at that point, nobody knew who he was. I could barely pronounce his last name. It was as complicated to pronounce as my last name is. And one thing led to another, and he got me into politics. I'd always been into history, so we bonded over that. And he got me into politics. And by the time I was in college, I started bugging him over and over again that, oh man, Nick, you've got so much wisdom. You need to share it with other people and not just with me. We need to have you run for something, right? Let's run you for state office. And he said no the first time, wisely. He also said no the second time. And eventually, after bugging him for about 4 or 5 years, I managed to finally convince him to run. He ran in 2015 and he got elected, and he's been in office ever since. But he wasn't really famous. He was just a state legislator, right? There's like 3,000 of those. It wasn't until probably his congressional run in 2020, when he ran for Congress and narrowly lost that race, that ironically enough, in defeat, we managed to figure out that he had the ability to generate a platform that has reached millions of people in the aftermath of that defeat, right? I mean, he now has over 1 million people that follow him on multiple different platforms. And it's been incredible watching people get to know the same guy that I knew back when I was in high school, right? And total strangers figuring out who he is on the internet.
That is, and you guys aren't close. You guys are actually fairly apart in age, right? I mean, he wasn't in high school with you. I mean,
no, he's 15 years older than me.
Okay,
it's basically half a generation.
Yeah, this is something I find that really makes for a good show. You want guys who are similar but not carbon copies of each other. And that's why you guys have a really good thing going here. You have different views than he does. He's married, and his kids are, I guess one of his kids started to get married. You're still single, so you have a lot of similar outlooks, but you also come from different perspectives. I think that really makes it work.
The back and forth is fantastic, and one of the topics you want to bring up today is actually something that Nick and we butt heads all the time on, because we have different life stories and experiences and perspectives, and we're in different age groups. And, he married his high school sweetheart when he was 19, and it was almost like a Cinderella story for him. And we've done plenty of podcasts, he and I, and his wife, Tina, and our, producer, Nick Hamilton. We've done plenty of podcasts on things like dating and marriage and the crazy clown world that we're currently inhabiting when it comes to all of that stuff.
Sometimes that works more often than it doesn't. And I think a lot of us all wish that it could have happened that way. I mean, I know that one couple who graduated from high school with me, and I think they were a couple since they were 9 or 10 years old, and it's like, boy, it's hard not to be jealous of that, just because you're never really out there, and if you're never really out there, you don't know what it's. I don't think you can possibly know what it's like.
And this is something that I talk to Nick all the time about this, both on and off camera, actually. And he acknowledges it. There was one episode that he did very early on in our podcast, the current format that we have, where it's the three of us, or sometimes if Tina's not available, just the two of us that are on. Very early on in that, so a year and a half ago, he did a podcast where he said a few things, and after the show, he and I actually kind of got into it, because I pushed back a little bit, and I was like, Nick, you keep talking about how, young men need to step up and do this and do that, and they're increasingly wondering, what's the payoff here? Like, every element of society keeps denigrating them and putting them down, and I know that that's not what you're trying to do. You're actually trying to give a positive message here, but it's not going to resonate with my generation and with the generation beneath them. I'm the youngest of the millennials. If you're born literally like a year or two after me, you're a Zoomer. So I am the when the documentaries come out in 50 years about the last people alive that remember the world before 9/11, I might be one of those type of people, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at the Zillennials, they say, right, the youngest millennials and the oldest Zoomers, and if you look at the younger Zoomers as well, right? If you look at anybody that's under the age of 35, really, or especially under the age of 30, what you find is that when it comes to this particular topic, which in some ways is more important than any other cultural or societal or political issue out there, there is just a massive disconnect between them and their parents, let alone them and their grandparents.
Yeah. I think there was also massive disconnects between, I was born in 1971 and my parents were born in the 30s. I don't think the disconnect is anything that particular to these generations. But it's the system has definitely changed. People said, well, that's just, you went, you got married because that was just what you did, and I don't. And now it's just complete chaos.
The dating market is not one to be envied right now. It's neither a buyer nor a seller's market, right? It's just the market doesn't even exist right now. It's a complete disaster. And again, if you talk to many people in their 20s, even people in their 30s that are single, a lot of them will tell you that, regardless of what their sex is or what their background is, or it is just, it's a mess. And I was able to get it across to Nick pretty quickly. He was pretty receptive to it, because he knows that he has a different experience, right? I said earlier, he got married right out of high school, and been happily married for over 20 years, and he has 3 fantastic kids, and his oldest daughter's now getting married as well. And so kudos to her for kind of breaking the trend that we've seen, which is the deterioration of marriage, the deterioration of the dating market, and his family has managed to navigate this pretty successfully, but he knows that there's a lot of people that haven't, right? And that he is the exception to the rule.
Yeah, and you all talked about the battle, between Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate. Nick seems like he's somewhere in the middle, but
yes.
But one thing you didn't bring up, though, is while Tate doesn't have any kids, we've already seen what's happened with Jordan Peterson's daughter. Married, baby, divorced, married again, second baby coming. I mean, how many more times is this going to happen? I don't really know. It's Tate doesn't have any kids, but if he has a daughter, I wouldn't be shocked if his daughter marries once and that's it.
Nick brought up something very interesting in that podcast about the battle for the male mind, and it was one of my favorite podcasts that we've ever done. Like you said, it was between, we analyzed Andrew Tate first, and then we analyzed Jordan Peterson. And they're both very controversial people for completely different reasons, right? Yeah. But one thing that we really try to get across in that is take aside your personal views of them as people and listen to what they have to say and why they are popular with specific elements of society, particularly young men, for completely different reasons. Again, if you're under the age of 30, or even under the age of 35, and you're a man and you listen to these two people, they're probably very popular. I know plenty of guys in my age group that especially if they're younger. A lot of guys in my age group might listen to somebody like Jordan Peterson. What's interesting is a lot of guys that are younger than me, in their early 20s or even in their teens, listen to Andrew Tate. And I think there's a reason for that. We could get into that today, but what Nick was trying to get across in that podcast, and I happen to agree with it, is that there's both things that these two men are saying that have absolutely resonated with huge chunks of young men. And people, especially on the left, get very upset for that. But there's a reason that that message is resonating with them, because there is a bit of truth to it. Now, there's plenty of things that Andrew Tate has done that Nick doesn't support and that I definitely don't necessarily condone. And there's other takes from Jordan Peterson that I don't agree with either. But I would say 70%, maybe even more, from both of them, I actually happen to agree with. And I think that it's that 30%, maybe even less than 30%, that a lot of people get hung up on. And that's the reason why they look at this and they're like, this is a big problem. Well, if you think it's a big problem, maybe you should analyze why so many young men are gravitating towards these men in the first place, rather than simply say, oh, it's just another example of toxic masculinity. That's a good way to turn off half of the entire population from whatever message you're trying to sell them.
Well, it seems like Tate has more the appearance of a good life. And the other thing, too, is, well, there's certainly been things done to Jordan Peterson. Tate's been falsely accused, and I think this is a very large divide as well. The men who have experienced some type of false accusation versus men who have not. And a lot of, I don't think false accusations where women go to the police and lie are that common. But I'm talking false accusations in social circles, false accusations on a job, maybe getting fired from a job, maybe getting, suspended from school for a week or getting thrown out of some conference. I think that is very common.
That is far more common than criminal legal action.
Yeah.
Civil legal action or the GSR strategies, the gossiping, shaming, and rallying. Those are, quite frankly, they're and I think it's because it's the over feminization of literally everything in society is part of the reason that you're seeing this happen, because those are the tactics that are commonly used. When men get aggressive, and this is a general statement, right? It's not a universal one, but there's absolutely some truth to it, right? When men get aggressive, there's always that threat of physical violence that's there.
Yeah.
When women get aggressive with each other, usually it's not a threat of physical violence. Usually it's, I will destroy you socially. And since we're no longer, barbarians living out on the steppes, hunting buffalo or anything like that, well, I guess, the Mongols wouldn't necessarily be hunting buffalo, but you get the point, right? We're no longer in these, agrarian societies where we're playing by a different set of rules, right? We have civilization, we have society. We're not out there fighting physically every day for survival. And because of that, the strength that comes along with that threat of physical force kind of dissipates, because you don't need to resort to physical force in order to eke out a living anymore, right?
Yeah.
But the threat of destroying you culturally and within society, right? Destroying your reputation, going after you, not necessarily criminally through the legal system, but through those GSR strategies, the gossiping, shaming, and rallying, that is incredibly powerful. And I'm lucky enough that I've never had any sort of accusation like that thrown against me, but I know other men that have. I have some friends that they weren't taken through the legal system, they were taken through the ringer. And it's incredibly destructive.
Oh yeah, it is. And Christian, this is something else too. Talking about the over feminization, or as Rollo Tomasi likes to call it, the gynocentric social order. I do not think that any of this coronavirus nonsense happens without it.
Oh, think about this. Looking back now, I can understand in theory in the very early day, like December 2019, when nobody knew what this was. I mean, there were people still telling us that it was coming out of a fish market in Wuhan, which obviously that was nonsense. But like very early on, when nobody knew what this thing was, I can understand why people might have been fearful at the time. But you had for years, mass institutional efforts to force people to conform to a set of strategies to address this that, quite frankly, were completely detached from reality. I mean, think about like the truckers' convoy and protest in Canada in early 2022, 2 years into this thing, and you had, or a year and a half into this thing, and you had the Prime Minister out in Canada, Justin Trudeau, that was using the force of government to shut down people's bank accounts because they weren't obeying things like masking mandates and vaccine mandates. And this was for something that by this point, the virus had a lethality rate of far beneath 1%. And yet there was this hysteria around it. Again, I could understand in December 2019 why people were worried about it. I could not understand why people in January 2022 we're still saying we need mask mandates, we need vaccine mandates, we need to we need another round of shutdowns. Quite frankly, people wanted to get on with their lives, and there were elements within the government that were, I agree with you, Chris, that were using this, quite frankly, scaremongering tactics into getting people to conform. And there's something to be said about how the over feminization of, like I said earlier, everything within society, I think, has contributed to that. If you didn't have that, I don't think that the response to coronavirus would have even remotely been in the same universe as the one that we unfortunately all had to live through.
I don't even think Ronald Reagan would have fallen for it, and I'm not that fond of Reagan, but certainly, and somebody like Tate was always talking like this was nonsense, And I do think there's a great deal of truth to what H.L. Mencken says. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, parenthesis, and hence clamorous to be led to safety, by menacing it by an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. It's like this is you make people scared of something and then you claim to provide the protection from it.
Well, I mean, it's about like an aversion of risk. Real or imagined, right? I mean, because H.L. Mencken also said that, democracy is the belief that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard, which is why there's always been a strong tradition within libertarian circles that certainly supports individual liberty, but is very questioning of whether or not democratic processes actually ensure individual liberty. I mean, you could look at Hayek as an example of somebody who brings up repeatedly that, hey, we have many examples of people voting themselves into despotism. And so the ability to simply vote one's government does not necessarily guarantee that you're going to secure liberty. And again, to circle back to why this happened, I think part of the reason it happened is because of an aversion to risk. And there's an element within feminist traditions that is risk averse for obvious reasons. When you look at biology and history, part of the reason that women are a lot more selective when it comes to mating than men is because of the incredible emotional and physical toll that it takes to go through that process and to have children, right? And so it makes sense for women to be far more risk adverse than men. This is also why when you look at things like IQ distributions, somebody once said that the same reason that you do not have a female Albert Einstein is the same reason that you do not have a female Jack the Ripper.
Was that Camille Paglia?
I believe so. And the argument here is that nature takes far fewer chances with women. Nature itself is risk adverse when it comes to gender, because again, the role that women play biologically is a lot different than the role that men play biologically. Nature can take a lot more chances with men because men, in some way, sperm is pretty cheap, whereas eggs are pretty expensive. And so, unfortunately, what that means is that the vast majority of idiots within society are men, but also the vast majority of incredibly intelligent, creative, successful entrepreneurs, inventors, scientists are also men.
Yeah, geniuses, but the IQ's all even out at 100 for both sexes. I always like to make the point. I don't know that many people who play, but I always make the point with bridge masters. Some of the best bridge players in the world are men, even though it's predominantly looked on as a woman's game.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's the whole, it's not that like women are risk adverse. It's that nature is risk averse when it comes to things that carry a much higher toll. And like I said earlier, sperm is a lot more expensive than eggs. And so what that produces is inherently a system where any female, not just within the human species, you can look at any species, are more risk adverse than the male equivalent, almost universally. And when that translates to humanity and civilization, and then eventually to politics and culture and society, what that means is that women by and large have a incentive to be more risk adverse than men. And sometimes that does them incredible good. Being risk adverse is not inherently a bad thing, right? What's inherently a bad thing is being irrationally risk adverse.
Yeah.
That's when it becomes very dangerous, right? And the way that you counter that traditionally is by pairing men and women together, because they tend to complement each other quite well. That's how civilization operates. But when you have this growing disconnect that you see between men and women, particularly younger men and women, that's when things start to fly off the rails, because what you're seeing is the mass separation of people by sex. That historically was not the thing. For example, you could go back to the 1970s and earlier, and there was not a large break between the voting patterns of men and women. Gerald Ford won the same percentage of men as he won the same percentage of women. But now we live in a world where it is, you could tell what somebody's politics are simply by looking at their sex and in their race. Although increasingly race is actually becoming depolarized, and now it's things like, what level of education do you have? Have you been indoctrinated by the university system? And so we're in uncharted waters right now, in the sense civilization, history, humanity has never been in this position where men and women are increasingly younger. Men and women are at odds with each other to the degree that they currently are right now.
And what's interesting too is this is happening in spite of the fact that they're trying to force men and women or boys and girls together. I mean, like trying to force the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts together, or trying to force all these. That's what I don't get. It seems like there's almost a rebellion against this forced integration, and I think there's always going to be cases, where boys and girls want to have their own different spaces. It's,
I wouldn't say that they're necessarily trying to force them together so much as I would say that they're trying to abolish the very concept of gender or sex altogether.
That's true. I went to this sort of a camp or a summer program out at Purdue in 1984, and we stayed in the dorms. And there was like the little, rec room and cafeteria in the middle, and on one side and on the other side, and both sides on one side it was men permitted only when escorted by a woman, and on the other side it was women permitted only when escorted by a man. Segregated dorms in 1984, which I don't think which hardly exist anywhere. Well, except at the really conservative schools, That was something they started doing in the 80s, and I'm just like, why are they doing this? It never made sense, But.
Well, I mean, it's, Nick and I did another podcast very recently where we talked about this split, particularly with younger men and women. Yeah. And we talked about many different countries around the world. It's not just the United States, right? We talked about the United Kingdom. We talked about Germany. We especially talked about South Korea. South
Korea is interesting, yeah.
There is a ongoing backlash right now, mostly by younger men, against a system that they view as being discriminatory towards them, or against them, I should say.
Yeah.
And what you've seen is historically, I mean, you can go back hundreds of years, right? Historically, younger generations tend to be more liberal than older generations, right? It's the old Winston Churchill quote that, if you're a liberal by 40, you don't have a brain, but if you're a conservative at 20, you don't have a heart. Well, so the idea is that, younger people tend to be more liberal, and then not all of them, but by and large, generations become more conservative as they get older. And so therefore, it should not be surprising to see both younger men and younger women to hold more left-wing views when they're in their teens and 20s. And then some, but not all, will then shift to the right and hold more conservative views when they enter their prime working years, like their 30s, their 40s, their 50s. But in South Korea, what you've seen is young men have kind of fallen off of that historical pattern and have veered very, very far to the right within a decade, within 8 years. And at the same time that young men have moved very far to the right, what you've seen with young women in South Korea is they've gone in the opposite direction, and they've flown off the rails into becoming very progressive, not just moderately left-wing or moderately liberal, like radically progressive within just a few years. Some of the most radical feminists in the world are now in South Korea. And what that has done is it's created not just a gap, it's created a chasm between the sexes in this country within the demographic that are the ones that are usually getting together, going on dates, getting married, and having children, which is also, by the way, part of the reason that you see South Korea has one of the lowest birth rates in the world, because nobody's interacting with each other. It's not that men and women are just at odds with each other politically. They view each other as enemies, which is unheard of. That's never been a thing. Men and women have never viewed each other as enemies for the entire history of humanity.
Yeah. Well, and going back to a state of nature, I think, there was the bargain, is okay, I'll protect my woman from the lions and the tigers, but as a result of that, I get to do, she's going to have my kids, it's now that you don't have to fight the lions and the tigers anymore. So you forget why these systems evolved. It's really getting, and if you look at, jobs, some of the most dangerous occupations are almost all dominated by males. I think we don't have good documentation of sex work because it's illegal. But outside of that, fishermen, lumberjacks, roofers. Those are some of the more dangerous jobs.
Construction in general.
Yeah.
Anything involving law enforcement or the military, overwhelmingly dominated.
I had a great uncle who died in a coal mining accident, left 6 orphans. At the time.
I remember I brought up to Tina, Nick's wife, who this wasn't like an adversarial thing. She was actually agreeing with me. We were talking about the radical feminization of certain things and modern day like fourth wave feminism and how the direction that's taken things. And I brought up to her a history analogy, mostly because I'm a massive history nerd, if you know anything about me. And I mentioned to her that a lot of people certainly in the United States don't know this, but even in France they don't know this. And I mentioned a date to her. I said August 22nd, 1914. It's a date that not even most French people remember, but they should, because it was the bloodiest day in the entire 1,000-year history of the French military, where they lost 27,000 people in one afternoon. Not injured, dead, killed in action in the opening weeks of World War I. It was the Battle of the Frontiers.
Yeah.
And then I asked her, I said, how many of them were women? And she was like, well, none. And I was like, yeah, that's the point. Yeah. Because and again, she wasn't disagreeing or arguing with me. We were having a mutual conversation about this, but I was just trying to bring a different perspective to the table, because if you go to France today and you look at the World War I cemeteries, that date is etched on more tombstones than any other date of the entirety of World War I. And the point that I was trying to get across is that younger men have sacrificed everything for the vast majority of history. And usually they have not asked for much more in return other than the ability to form families of their own. Yeah. And now that is being taken away from them. And we should not be surprised when the results of that are going to be incredibly ugly. And I don't mean ugly in the sense that young men are going to become radicalized. Yes, that is happening. What I mean is that it's going to be ugly for everybody in the sense that the pillars that hold society up are starting to crumble in ways that we have never, we're conducting an experiment that we have never done before. And I think we're going to be very dissatisfied with the results of that.
You said that date was August 22nd, you said?
August 22nd, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize. This is something less people know about. Do you know about the War of the Triple Alliance?
Are you, which one? I mean,
that was when Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay attacked Paraguay, and people tell me
Paraguay lost something like 40% of their population or some absurd number.
Yeah, and people tell me that's, I mean, if you're a man and you want to be treated like a king, go there. It's still apparently that way.
Yeah, Paraguay never recovered.
Because they lost so many men in that war.
Yeah, it was, I mean, you know, Nick and I joke about that too. It was like, you know, the greatest time in the last century or so to be a young man was to be in, you know, 1920s France. Because the ones who survived the war, you know, it was the opposite of the, you know, Pareto distribution, right? You didn't have hypergamy in 1920s France. So but I mean, the tragedy in that is that, again, until recently, you didn't have examples of hypergamy. In fact, the last time until today, until the modern era, that you've seen examples of this where it's, you know, both men and women are dissatisfied with the marriage market or dating market for completely different reasons. You would have to go back to like the Bronze Age when like polygamy was very common to see the last time that society has been through something like this. And there's a reason that societies got rid of polygamy, in part because the ruling class enjoyed polygamous relationships, right? But what they realized is that their soldiers are not going to go out there on the field and fight to preserve their local Bronze Age kingdom when king is sleeping with their wife or taking their, you know, their, you know, their marriage prospects away from them and then keeping them in the little, you know, the royal harem, right? You're not going to be able to maintain a military if the king has 200 wives and all of his soldiers don't have any families of their own. They're going to overthrow the monarchy.
I like to use the same analogy, you know, about, you know, 11 boys on the football team and 11 cheerleaders. If every boy on the football team gets to hook up with a cheerleader, you know, but if all the cheerleaders are hooking up with 2 or 3 guys on the football team's falling apart.
Yes, if 11 cheerleaders are throwing themselves at the quarterback.
Yeah.
Don't be surprised when the offensive line decides not to block for the, you know, not to block a sack in the next game, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a
the thing is that those 11 cheerleaders are going to figure out pretty quickly that quarterback is just going to go through every single one of them and treat them like trash.
Yeah. And you know,
that's why I say that it's not just destructive to young men. It's actually what we're going through right now is incredibly destructive to young women as well.
For
different reasons.
You know, Christian, this brings up something else, and maybe it's from my own personal experience, but I don't think women realize how powerful it is when women give men something to live up to. And when they do that, it's, you know, whether it be the football team or whatever, it's, you know, when they can do something and they think about, you know, thank you for supporting me. I think it's huge. And when instead you have a culture where women are constantly talking about, you know, all men are rapists and all this other stuff, there's nothing to live up to anymore. There's no occasion to rise to. There's no reason to be great because you're going to be condemned no matter what you do. And so you just give up and don't try to be great.
Yeah. You know, Nick told me once that, you know, part of the reason that our soldiers stormed Omaha Beach was because they had a wife back at home or a girlfriend back at home that was waiting for them. And then somebody brought up in our comment section, actually, of that recent podcast that, okay, but what do you do to the men that don't have anybody back at home waiting for them? How can you ask them to storm Omaha Beach?
Yeah.
There's nothing in it for them. And that's something that I've also tried to get across to Nick. And
yeah.
I think he understands the danger of the situation we're now in, because he brings up that, look, it's always been up to young men to rectify whatever crisis is in society, whether it's a war or an economic crash or social upheaval. The burden has always fallen on young men. We can debate all day long whether that's fair or just. What we can't debate is that is the way that it has been for the entirety of human history. And there's a reason for it, because young men are usually the most capable to address whatever the crisis is, either physically or in many cases intellectually, right? Which goes back to the whole distribution of IQs and how, look, the vast majority of inventions and breakthroughs and discoveries have usually come from young men in their 20s or 30s. That's just the way that it is. Just like how the vast majority of wars have usually been fought by young men in their 20s and 30s or in their late teens. And the point that he was trying to make was, you can argue that it's not fair, but you have to stand up and step up and take this responsibility because, and then he said the line, because your children are counting on you. And then I brought up to him, but Nick, that's the problem, because these men don't have children of their own. They don't have anything to lose. And that's what makes it so incredibly dangerous what we're in right now, because when you don't have any stake in the game, right? When you have nothing to lose within the current system, then you're not going to stand up and step up and try to fight to preserve things, because you're going to look at the way that things are and you're going to say the system's rigged against me. You're going to become a reactionary or a revolutionary and say, no, I don't want to stand up for the way that things currently are. I want to overthrow the way that things currently are because I'm dissatisfied with how they currently are. And that's the direction that I think we're moving in. That's why I think that you're seeing, for example, in South Korea, why young men have fallen off a cliff in terms of the historical pattern of usually being on the left when they're younger and then slowly becoming more conservative as they get older. No, they're becoming more conservative right now because they're dissatisfied with the way that things are. They see this left-wing march towards whatever you want to call it, intersectionality, wokeism, cultural Marxism. It doesn't matter what you call it. They're seeing the results of that system, and they're seeing it as denigrating them and creating a oppressor versus oppressed analysis of the entirety of society. And they're placing young men in the oppressor column. And their response is, if you're going to call me an oppressor and there's nothing I can do to escape from it, then there's no reason for me to negotiate with you. Because no matter what I do, I'm always going to be a villain in your story. Well, guess what? I don't care if I'm a villain in your story because you're a clown in mine.
Yeah. That's exactly what's happened. It's what they also call the victim triangle. There's the victim, the perpetrator, and the rescuer. And I think that's, you end up with somebody who wants to be the rescuer. In this case, it's the government that wants to be the rescuer. And something I've noticed about a lot of white knights, people who like male feminists and stuff like that, a lot of times they are covering up a past of bad behavior or something else. Some people say they're doing it to get laid, which I don't think is necessarily the case. I think it goes a lot deeper than that.
Part of it is social pressure. It's not just, because we joke, especially like a decade ago, about the male feminist that, bro, you're not going to get laid by, spouting all this rhetoric and stuff like that. That was definitely a thing. Like when I was like at the tail end of high school, early years in college for myself, that there was an element of that. There weren't many of them, but they were a thing. I don't think it's just a desire to like try to get laid. Certainly there's aspects of that are true, but I think a lot of it is the social conditioning and the immense amount of social pressure to adhere to a particular ideology, because you want to be labeled the good guys, right? And the good guys hold the quote correct opinions, and so therefore you must hold the correct opinions because you wouldn't want to be a bad guy, would you? And when you're in your early 20s, because this is the counterpoint to what I said earlier about how young men traditionally have been the ones that have stepped up and built civilization or preserved civilization or saved civilization, depending on what part of the cycle you're in at the moment, right? Well, the counterpoint is there is a Achilles heel in the fact that many young men, for obvious reasons, lack some of the experience that older men have, right? And lack some of the wisdom that older men have. They might have, they might achieve some sort of breakthrough, but they might not necessarily know how to apply that breakthrough in practical society because they just don't have the years worth of experience to know how to do it, right? So, for example, a young man might invent something, but he might not know how to best apply that invention to society as it currently functions because he simply hasn't spent enough years functioning within society to know how it functions. It might be the older generation that actually takes that and then applies it in a way that practically has effect. And I mean, a good example of this is a lot of the reforms of the Roman military were initially discovered within the ranks of, the lower ranks of the soldiers actually fighting in their 20s. But then it would be older men. It would be people like Marius or Sulla or Caesar that would actually then take the innovations that were coming out of their legions that they were commanding and then realize this is how you practically apply this and scale it up in order to win every single campaign and battle that we ever need to fight. And so the downside to that, why am I saying all this? The downside to the fact that younger men usually are the ones that stand up and step up to preserve civilization is also that younger men, in many respects, also kind of lack the experience to know when they're being duped, right? And so this is why you get a lot of younger men that, they feel this pressure to get along and go along, and many of them go ahead and do it because they haven't had the years yet to figure out that, no, this is all BS. And pushing a narrative about how I need to be the white knight or I need to be the champion of feminism or I need to embrace intersectionality and wokeism is actually incredibly self-destructive, not just for me, but for everybody.
Yeah.
And they might not learn that until either a false accusation gets thrown their way and they realize that there is no such thing as a good ally. They're always going to be an oppressor, or they get up there a little bit in years and they enter their mid or late 20s or early 30s. And then they realize that they were helping to perpetuate a lie, right? And so I think that there's always going to be that push and pull within the younger demographic to adhere to whatever culture and society says is acceptable. But you know what? You're seeing it even with them. For example, there's been some polls that have come out recently that show that there's a greater percentage of young men, and when I say young men, I mean the youngest of young men, like 16 to 21, right? There's a greater percentage of those young men than any other age group of men out there who say that feminism has done more harm than good.
Yeah.
It's kind of incredible if you think about it.
I also think that men are seeing things happen to more and more of their heroes, whether it be Johnny Depp and Amber Heard or Trevor Bauer, or I think they're asking themselves, what has this done for me? It seems to promote this culture of victimization and false accusations. I've even getting a point to where I see males engaging in this kind of behavior, which is rather shocking, but
I think it's in some ways even worse in the sense that I think a lot of men, especially a lot of young men, don't even have heroes and role models to look up to anymore. It used to be that, everybody could look up to somebody depending on what your interest was, right? Like, for example, Nick, when he was growing up, he looked up to John Wayne a lot, in part because he watched a lot of his movies, and Wayne was a little bit, older in the sense that his movies were coming out, when Nick was a little kid, or the tail end of it when Nick was a little kid. But, it was like the generation before Nick was born that Wayne was a famous movie star. And so, when Nick was a kid, he would watch some of these movies that at this point were like 15 or 20 years old from his standpoint. But there was a lot to admire about, the positive side of masculinity that somebody like him embodied. And you don't see that nowadays. I mean, look at Hollywood today, for example. Everything's about girl bossing, and every single depiction of a man, both real or fictional, is always he's an idiot and he needs some more intelligent, perfect woman to come along and fix whatever mess he's made. I mean, think about even fictional examples. This is something that Nick and I brought up, that like some of a more recent famous fictional male role model was like Luke Skywalker, and look what Disney did to him, right? And then look at like what they did with like the sequel movies, where it's like Rey is the female Mary Sue protagonist that never loses a battle and is a perfect person in every single way. And that's just one example. Almost everything that has come out within Hollywood is always about the strong female character that doesn't need any man to save her or doesn't need any man to do anything. In fact, she does the saving of the men because they're all stupid idiots. It's the Homer Simpson effect, right?
Yeah.
I think that's actually part of the reason that you see a lot of young men that look to somebody like Andrew Tate as a role model. Yeah. Or for that matter, somebody like Jordan Peterson as a role model, because they don't have any other option. There is no, society has not given them anybody to look forward to. Society's instead said, you need to apologize for your toxic masculinity. And that is not a message that's going to resonate with them for long. Some of them might stomach it because they feel guilted into doing it, right? But there will always be a backlash eventually. You cannot raise an entire generation of people into thinking that they're the villain and they need to perpetually apologize for something that they have no control over. They didn't get to choose to be born male, which is also part of the reason that you're seeing an explosion of transgender identification within this same age group, because what's the one way that you can escape this? Well, you can identify as trans, and then immediately you get moved from being the oppressor to being the oppressed. And then you get elevated into sacredness by the same ideology that is going out there saying that, well, one of the great things that's wrong with society is toxic masculinity, right? And so every single male is an oppressor, especially every single young male is an oppressor, especially every single white young male is an oppressor. But again, the way that you can escape that is you just no longer identify as that. And it's a lot easier to identify as trans than it is to identify as transracial, right? So I think that what you're seeing is that the response is unique to each young man. Some young men are just kind of go along to get along, and they just don't want to ruffle any feathers. Some men are seeing this as an opportunity to try to sleep with as many women as they can. Some young men are falling into despair, and they're basically self-destructing because society has said you're evil, and they haven't even done anything with their lives yet. They're 16 years old or 18 years old. They're in high school or barely completed it. They haven't achieved anything yet, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're just beginning their lives, and yet they're being told by every element within society, from Hollywood to the media to academia to Silicon Valley and Wall Street to the government itself, that you are the problem. And so some are just shutting down. They're secluding themselves. They're not going out. They're not making friendships. They're not entering the dating market. They're just shutting down. And which is why you're seeing an explosion of suicide rates within young men as well. And then some are trying to escape it by going into identifying as trans. You're seeing an explosion of young men that are now identifying as young women because they're trying to escape this as well. And then some are rebelling and they're going the red pill route, right? They're going the Andrew Tate route. And then some are trying to go like the philosopher route, the Jordan Peterson route. And then some are just going full black pill, which is even beyond red pill. And they're saying, the MTAL, right? The men going their own way, right? And so they're going the South Korea male route, where it's like, oh, I know my enemy now. My enemy is feminism and wokeism and intersectionality and cultural Marxism, and anybody that supports that is my enemy. And then some are becoming the very monster, so to speak, that wokeism is trying to claim all young men are, and they're becoming incredibly misogynistic in response to it. So I've listed 6 or 7 different routes that a lot of young men are going down, and they're kind of going in different directions because there's nobody to guide them or give them any sort of direction or purpose, and so they're just kind of being scattered to the winds. And each young man is trying to figure out how to navigate the clown world that we're currently in, and they're going about it in different ways, usually based on their own personality, their own life experience, their own circumstances, and that's taking them in vastly different directions. The problem is that the vast majority of those different directions are incredibly self-destructive, right? Either they become introverts and they lock themselves up in their house and they don't go out, or they become trans, or they fall into those deaths of despair that I was just talking about earlier. Like, those are all incredibly self-destructive, right? I do think that the other groups are at least trying to fight back or push back, but even then there's no cohesive strategy to it, right? It's just raw backlash. And I think that young men are waiting for somebody to come along and give them a sense of purpose.
I think young men are, and sometimes young men just have an obsession. They get obsessed with video games or something like that. The least destructive solution, I think, for a lot of men, like, we hear more and more talk about the passport bros. I know a guy who's just had his second kid in Mexico, and he's an American. He loves Mexico. He loves his wife, and he loves what he's doing down there. And he's just got this attitude. I'm glad I'm in Mexico because I couldn't do it in America, because apparently in Mexico, the woman gets nothing in divorce. That's what he told me.
Well, I mean, personally, I think no-fault divorce has been a disaster for the West in general. I think that part of the reason that you're seeing a lot of men checking out, varying different definitions of checking out, right? But I think part of the reason that you're seeing men checking out is because they're looking at it and they're like, what exactly do I get out of this, right? At best, there's a 50% chance that this will succeed, but if it doesn't, I lose everything, right? I lose my kids, I lose half of my fortune, and I have my life destroyed. And that's just through the legal system. Again, remember the whole GSR stuff?
Oh yeah.
So like there's a lot of young men that are concluding, and it's a tragedy that it is, but it's not unjustified, right? They're concluding that this isn't worth it.
Yeah.
And other men are looking around and they're saying, well, I've got no shot anyway, so I'm not even going to try. And then other men are like, even if I do have a shot, quite frankly, I don't want to spend the rest of my life with somebody that's with the options that I've got in front of me. Because, you know, and they bring this up in a lot of these podcasts, you know, like the whatever podcasts and stuff like that. You know, people bring up that, you know, the average guy today is being asked to put in 5 times the amount of work for somebody that is not even 1/5 quality of the type of woman that his grandmother was.
Yeah. And I don't know why. And not to mention, it's impossible for men to figure out what the rules are. I mean, you know, some women may want a guy to hold the door open, other women don't. And there's no way for this guy to know. It's just like he has to be a mind reader. And I think there was a time when the rules were simple. But, you know, here's something else, too, that I just popped up today in my feed. It was from L. And it said, my wife and I have been together for 5 years now, and we have a 2-year-old. We were planning to extend our family. I decided to tidy my wife's closet up because there was a mold problem in the garage, and I decided to inspect the whole house. There I found a gym bag with clothes, some dry fruits, some tampons, and like $1,000. I asked my wife about it, and her face suddenly lost its color. So apparently, this was his wife's bug out bag.
Yeah, the go bag. I read this post.
The go bag. Yeah, and I'm like, it's like, first of all, why are you marrying this guy if you think he could possibly do that? And I also think it's unbelievably insulting.
It is. And there was an exchange on X.
Yeah.
This might be the first time in history that I've addressed Twitter as X. But there was this exchange on X about this. I believe this was posted on Reddit. Yeah. And there was this feminist who was tweeting about it, got many, many likes, and was like, oh, this is totally reasonable. In fact, the fact that this man was upset about it is exactly the type of red flag that this woman was worried about. And that, you know, she's totally justified to have this, you know, stash set away to run away from him at a moment's notice. And then somebody brought up that, like, what an incredibly self-destructive way to view somebody that you're supposed to want to spend your entire life with, that he's a potential abuser. And then she replied and said, well, all men are potential abusers. And then somebody asked the totally reasonable question, which is, why would any man want to have a relationship with somebody that views him as a potential abuser? Again, this thought process is part of the reason that you're seeing the breakdown of the family. It's part of the reason that you're seeing the complete destruction of the dating and marriage market right now. Because no self-respecting man is going to want to spend 5 seconds around somebody that views him as a threat when he wants to love somebody and have a family with that person. He's gonna rapidly conclude, we have different worldviews here. We have different takes on what it means to form a relationship and a marriage. If you're going to view me as a potential abuser, then maybe you need to go find somebody else. Because I don't want to spend my life with somebody that is fearful of me. I want to spend my life with somebody that loves me and respects me. And clearly you're not doing that.
Yeah.
It's just a complete disconnect from reality here.
Oh, yeah. You know, and I saw women that I actually respect defend this. And, you know, I might say the same thing, though. What happens if a guy gets married, he still has some secret offshore bank account? You know, it's... So if my wife divorces me, there's still money that she can't get, she doesn't know about. You know, it's, you know,
that entire exchange, and then the Twitter responses that happened and the back and forth between, you know, random accounts and this more famous feminist, I mean, just really illustrated to me like what the hour is when it comes to the type of relationship that we're seeing between young men and women. I don't even have a word for it.
Yeah.
This was not a thing, and I'm 29. This was not a thing 20 years ago when I was in elementary school. The visceral hatred in suspicion that exists between the sexes, and not between the sexes in general. Like, this is not a problem with, you know, 65-year-olds. This is not a problem with your grandkids. This is a problem within the demographics that are supposed to be kids right now. And then we wonder why the birth rate is collapsing. Well, part of the reason the birth rate is collapsing is because we've indoctrinated people into viewing the other sex as their enemy and a potential abuser. That's part of the reason. Women don't trust men, and men are looking at women and saying, you're crazy and you've flown off the rails. Remember the South Korea example? Somebody came up with a meme that showed the ideological curve in the again, the trend line was 18 to 29-year-olds. They were both, you know, in the same wavelength, so to speak. And then in the last 10 years or so, women flew up towards liberalism and men flew down towards conservatism. And somebody made a meme response to that graph showing the you know, political direction of young men and women. And the meme was showing that, you know, with young women, it was, you know, they're doing this. And then the graph would say something like, you know, I know things are getting weird, but I don't want to offend anybody. And then the bar showing the direction of young men going the opposite direction. And it just simply said, I'm done pretending.
Yeah, I think men are kind of done pretending. You know, I don't know if this is, and you know, I can tell you one of the weirdest personal examples. You know, I go to it. I do try to get out and be active now and then. I think online is a disaster, but and so I'm at ecstatic dance, if you know what that is. And I'm holding my watch in my hand and I'm doing these breathing exercises. And a little later, the guy running the thing comes and said, "Hey, what's going on with that watch?" And said, "Oh, I was just doing these breathing exercises. That's why I was, you know, like 4 seconds inhale, 6-second exhale, things like that. You know, you do these." And he said, "Oh, you're fine." You know, I said, "What?" He said, "What? You thought I was recording something with these watches? Or I mean, what's the where do these paranoid delusions come from?" And I just remember thinking, something like this would only happen at this environment, because this is an environment where a lot of these hippie types go, people who are into polyamory and stuff like that. It's like, you know, this wouldn't happen with them. I'm like, why do I bother with this? You know, go somewhere else. You know, it's just you just ask yourself. You know, I sometimes wonder, you know, if one thing, men just ought to start wearing body cams all the time and record everything that happens to them.
Be like the police. No, I mean, honestly, what I think is going to happen is that reality will just ultimately win out. And here's what I mean by this. I mean that it is I don't have I wish I had the answer. If I had the answer, I wouldn't be in the circumstances that myself, you know, that I'm currently in. But it is rough to be a zillennial or an older Zoomer or a younger millennial and be a man right now. It is rough. But Gen Alpha, the generation that has come after Zoomers, so like they're the little kids right now. The parents that are currently raising them have got to realize that we've got at best 10 or 20 years to turn the ship around. And we have to raise that generation to do the opposite of the type of clown world theatrics that we have seen perpetuated on the previous generations that have come before. Because if we don't fix the problem, beginning with the education of the current generation, and this is something that Nick has tried to stress a lot, in part because he has a bunch of Gen Alpha kids, right? If we don't fix the problem with the current generation, we will end up like South Korea, right? Where the society in South Korea has been torn in two. The birth rate has collapsed. The marriage rate has collapsed. Men and women view each other as enemies. Political radicalism is flown off the rails. I mean, there's like attempted assassinations of prominent politicians in South Korea now, almost on a monthly basis at this point. there was the leader of the opposition in South Korea that was like stabbed in the neck at a party rally a few weeks ago. And the reason why you're seeing this happen is because everybody has lost their minds in this country. And I totally understand where the young men are coming from in that country, because they're looking at wokeism imposed on them top down from their own government, and they're waging an ideological war on themselves.
Yeah.
And so if we want to avoid that fate, we have to make sure that the generation that is currently entering their formative years right now don't undergo the same type of intellectual nonsense that my generation went through.
Yeah.
And the Zoomers are going through. But unfortunately, that doesn't fix the problem of, okay, great, but what do we do with the current generation that should be getting married right now? And some people might have the answer in the form of, we'll just be a passport bro. Other people might have the answer in taking the red pill, right? Go the Andrew Tate route. Or other people might have the answer in taking the black pill, which is even more extreme than the red pill. And then people might take the black pill is basically the MTOW, right? The men going their own way. But the problem is that most of those approaches are not going to get us back to where we used to be. And I think that there's still this longing for nostalgia, in the sense that ultimately, I think that what most young men want is not going their own way or passport bro or red pill or black pill or whatever. Like, what most men want is just what their grandparents had.
Yeah, I think that's what they want. Yeah, there's another thing we haven't mentioned too. This could be how this could play. What happens with artificial intelligence and sex bots?
So good and bad.
Yeah,
that is pretty obvious, right? You'll see an explosion of pornography and addiction and stuff like that. Yeah. The good is that the AI element of that will probably put OnlyFans out of business.
Yeah, it will. And I don't know about you, but I come from that generation where for the first time I saw dirty pictures was in a magazine. It's which definitely changed things. I think the fact that it's so.
The wholeflation that whatever podcast people talk about, that there's a good chance that will come to an end, because AI will, your AI girlfriend will be, nobody will be able to compete with that. The bad aspect of that is that you're going to see more young men that are probably going to become even more secluded.
Yeah.
And take aside even like the sex aspect of it. Just think about AI in a more broad sense, in the sense that even absent of things like pornography or sex, but the other things that AI can end up doing, there's an even less reason for you to now go out of your house, because everything's at your fingertips now. And that's a double-edged sword, right? I've always joked that on my phone, I have more knowledge here on my phone at my fingertips than existed in the entirety of the Library of Alexandria.
Oh yeah.
Right. But that there's a double-edged sword there, because there's so much information and knowledge available that it's almost like we're drowning in it and we don't know what to do with it. And it's there's a plethora of choices out there. I cannot remember the term, but there's a marketing term to describe when there's too many options, the consumer actually struggles to pick because there's too many options.
Yeah.
And so when you're drowning in information, you might not know how to process that information. And so in some ways it's actually counterproductive. The positive side is you have more information than ever before. And so the problems that we have is not a lack of information. It might be that the problem that we have is we don't know how to sort through the information. We don't know how to process anything. And so AI is one of these things that yes, there's definitely an element there that on the sex side and stuff like that, that AI is going to be incredibly destructive in many different respects. Destructive in the sense that it's going to lead to more addiction and stuff like that, but also destructive in the sense that, quite frankly, certain things within society that are pushing this divide with men and women, like the extreme hypergamy, like the explosion of sex work, and things like OnlyFans and stuff like that you're seeing, those young women that are falling into that trap, they're going to find themselves basically being outcompeted very quickly by AI, right? And they're gonna find out that they were sold a bill. They were sold a lie. They were sold a bill of goods that ultimately ended up just ruining them. But when you expand your scope of AI beyond just that, I think that what you're going to see is people are going to retreat from society even more, because why go out into society when everything that you could possibly want is at your fingertips, everything other than an actual genuine friendship, which is the one thing that I think is missing here. Online friendships are increasingly the norm for Zoomers and younger millennials. Like, most people under the age of 30 would probably say they have more friends on the internet than they do in real life. And this is something that older generations, I don't think, can fully appreciate. I had a friend that my best friend that I went to college with, that came over, and we hung out for the weekend. And we were talking, and he was like, yeah, I had this friend that, told me about this. We were talking about, drinks and stuff like that, just things that we had, passions about. And he was sharing me some recommendations about a few things. And he was like, yeah, I had this friend that recommended this to me. And he was talking about like a particular like mixed drink or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, cool. Who told you that? And he was like, oh, it's somebody that I don't actually know. It's just on the internet. And I was like, oh, okay. So this is actually a common thing. It's not like unique to me or unique to my friend here. Like, this is actually just a common thing that, like, if you're under the age of 30, everybody now has internet friends, right? It's either Discord or Twitter or YouTube or Facebook. Like, you at best, you meet somebody on the internet 6 months before you meet them in person. But usually you just meet somebody on the internet and you never meet them in person. And you know what? There might be some incredible good about that. Like, for example, my friend was able to get some neat ideas for mixed drinks from somebody that knows more about that than him.
Yeah.
So there's some positives to that. But the negative is that online friendships can never fully replace what in-person friendships are.
Yeah.
To give you an example, Nick is currently in Richmond. He's a member of the House of Delegates. So he's in Richmond right now. He's remote. When we record our podcast, Nick and myself and his wife Tina and our co-producer Hamilton, Nick is calling in remotely. He's not in this room recording the studio across the table from me and we're having a face-to-face conversation. He physically cannot do that right now because he's in Richmond in the House of Delegates. And I can tell you, it is different when he and I are talking across a screen versus when we're in the same room together. I don't like it as much. I enjoy the 2-hour conversation where Nick and I are at the table and we're discussing stuff, history, politics, philosophy, theology, culture, society. Like when we're having those deep conversations that form the core of the Making the Argument podcast in person, I love it. We could go all day long. But when we're talking over a screen, we just don't click as well. It's not that we don't click, but we just don't click as well. And so now take that, and we know each other. I've known Nick for 12 years. Now take that and apply it to two random people on the internet that have never met each other in person, have never formed those personal connections, and all that they know each other from is an avatar and some text messaging. Yeah. Again, I'm not saying it's bad. I have plenty of friends that I only know through the internet, and I still cherish those, but I know that it is not a suitable substitute for the real thing. And I think one of the big problems that we have is that we've discarded impersonal real friendships in exchange for online friendships. And we're now realizing that does not fill the gaping hole in our hearts for some sort of meaning or purpose. It just doesn't fully fill it. It's better than nothing, but it doesn't fully fill it.
Yeah. I learned that. I learned that long before the internet, just, when I was a teenager, having this one really intimate, emotional phone call with it. My friend said, call her, we talked on the phone. And then a couple of days later we met. It was like, okay, it's like suddenly all that chemistry wasn't there anymore just from meeting in person, which is why I always say, that's one reason why I hate personal ads. Cause you've got to get to a real life meeting, but and so many, I think for a lot of women, they just go there for the dopamine hits of getting all this attention and they don't actually want to get out and meet. I mean, it's like, well, if you don't want to meet somebody in person, why are you here? Granted, you go meet at a neutral site, you meet at a coffee shop or whatever, but there's something else too, Christian, that you realize too. Once I was in my 20s, I realized it's hard. It is hard to find a social life as an adult. And it's also especially hard to find a social life even as a teenager that does not revolve around getting drunk.
What's interesting is that younger generations actually drink a lot less than older ones.
I'm really glad to see that, that you actually just go out and do things. You go out and do things and you really have fun just to have fun. That is one thing I appreciate about Austin, is that you can actually find a social life. And I do think with meetup.com, social media to a certain extent helps out. I think social media can facilitate real life meetings. I took acting classes, and that's how I keep track of where my classmates are going to have plays, for example. I go to their plays because of, but I'm glad to hear that, because I think it's that you can actually go and have real friendships. It's like,
the sad part is that I think that the reason that like Zoomers and younger millennials drink a lot less is not because like, oh, that's a good thing that they're not becoming drunk alcoholics. I think part of the reason why is because they're kind of shutting down and shutting off. And as you brought up, like drinking used to be like a social activity. Well, they're not engaged in social activities. And so therefore they're not drinking because they're not engaged in social activities. It's not because they're a bunch of teetotaling, prohibitionists. It's because they are not forming those social relations with people, either with the opposite sex in the form of dating and eventually marriage, but just with anybody, right? Regardless of men and women, right? And so it's like it's a positive in the sense that like, yay, alcoholism and drunkenness are falling, but it's like they're falling for the wrong reasons. They're falling because Zoomers and younger millennials they're shutting down. They're not going out and forming these relationships.
yes,
Everybody's becoming a shut-in.
And maybe that is the reason, and that's unfortunate. I mean, I love, for example, and granted, I don't like going to bars, but I love to go to private karaoke parties. Where just people put up a laptop and say, "Oh, we're going to do karaoke here." It's like, oh, great, yes. Yeah, maybe that is the truth. Maybe they've heard too many, but yeah, that could be the reason. It's that might be interesting. It's or maybe they just hear too many negative stories. About like, well, I might lose control and end up having a roll and scream or something like that. It's.
I think a lot of them. Another thing, we were mentioning COVID earlier. I don't think that we fully appreciate, in part because like neither of us went through it. Like I was lucky that I was no longer in like high school or even college for that matter. I was working to get my master's, and it impacted that. I had to get that remotely, but I couldn't go in person. But that's different. That was post grad. Me seeking a post grad degree. For think about the high schoolers that were living through COVID.
Oh yeah,
and the damage that did. The lockdowns for years of remote learning, not forming those connections, and not being able to even know how to form those personal connections, or even think about the middle schoolers, right? That are like the early teens that are for the first time they're forming those relationships with people, and now they don't get the ability to do it, and then COVID ends, and now they're entering college or they're entering the workforce, and they don't know how to socialize. And it's not necessarily their fault. It's because that was robbed from them. And I don't really appreciate the fact that like it's actually going to get worse before it gets better, because we think it's bad now with like, again, older Zoomers and younger millennials becoming shut-ins and not engaging with the rest of society for a myriad of reasons. Think about the younger Zoomers that were in high school or middle school when the world lost its mind and decided you're not allowed to go out there and play and make friendships with your own people in your age group.
Yeah. I've
an immense amount of psychological and developmental damage that did to them.
Yeah, sometimes I've walked by a bus stop in my neighborhood, and sometimes I see these kids, and it's just like, they're not acting like kids. It's like, I remember how we acted when, we were just talking and being silly and, just, the way you'd expect them to be. They said they seem awfully quiet. Well, why are they so quiet? They shouldn't be that quiet, Yeah, it's definitely, I don't know what, I don't know what to say about it all. It's definitely not, the places where you got socialize it, it does make me wonder if they're all just getting shut in. I don't know. So I mean, sometimes I wonder, as an older man, what would happen if I went up to if I was in better shape, but I go out to a college basketball game and I approach one of the cheerleaders, and obviously I'm a lot older than she is, but I said, well, yes, sweetie, but at least I know how to approach girls, you know.
Actually, to that point, this is something that I've heard from younger women, like in my age group, is that they bring up that like men don't know how to approach them anymore.
Yeah.
And this is also something that's kind of unique.
Yeah.
And it ties in a bit with the coronavirus stuff and the shutdowns. And, a lot of men just don't know how to engage with society. A lot of women also don't know how to engage with society. But it might manifest itself in different ways. Well, a lot of younger women that are like in their 20s or, any span in their 20s, right? Young, early 20s all the way to late 20s will say that like, yeah, men in my age group don't know how to like approach me or talk to me. And I've actually joked with people that like, hey, I'm one of those younger men that like, I don't know. I joke all the time, like on the podcast, self-deprecating humor, that like, hey, my biggest problem is I don't know how to talk to women. And I think there's, there's a bit of truth to that in the sense that like younger men are I think really intimidated with the prospect of talking to women. And I honestly, can we blame them?
Yeah, because there's always this, because the woman might scream, "Hey, he's talking to me! Don't talk to me!" One of the I don't know if you ever heard the story of Elevator Gate, as they called it. It was at this atheism conference, and the woman gets on the elevator, and then the guy gets on the elevator, and while they're in the elevator, the guy just happens to say, "Hey, I'm interested. You want to go for drinks or something?" And she gets off the elevator, and she later complains, "He asked me, in the elevator," which probably isn't a smart thing to do because you're in a closed space where the woman can't get away. But still, it's like, why are you getting on this guy just because he asked you and you said no? It's like, it's still a crime. The fact that you ask, say the woman says no, you walk away, and it's still an offense.
Yeah, I mean, the Me Too movement, let's be honest, is certainly a big contributing factor behind all of this. A lot of men are, again, like I said earlier, intimidated to even talk to young women because they saw what happened 5-10 years ago with the Me Too movement, right? And so like when you're subjected to the perpetual HR department, right? That's your punishment to engaging with the other sex in any sort of capacity. And especially, again, if you're a younger man and you went through COVID when you were in college or high school or middle school, and so you're already dealt a terrible deck of cards because the government decided you're not allowed to be a kid at a time when, quite frankly, kids were the ones that were the least affected by COVID in terms of illness and death and stuff like that. And yet the government decided that, again, we're going to shut down all the schools and not allow you to go out there and make friendships in your most formative years. We should not at all be surprised when so many young men are just like, okay, I'm just going to shut down and self-destruct, right? I'm just going to become a shut. I'm just not going to talk to anybody. I'm not going to form any friendships or relationships with anybody, let alone with somebody of the opposite sex. Like the problem is that we have created so many perverse incentives within society, intentionally or otherwise, that have resulted in where we currently are today.
Yeah.
And if we ever want to fix this problem, the first thing we need to do is we need to stop applying the oppressor versus oppressed framework to everything, let alone to the sexes. That is probably the single most destructive thing here. When you keep telling young men they are oppressors, do not be surprised when they either self-destruct or they decide, okay, fine, then I will become the villain you think I am.
Yeah,
and
yes. Like,
both of those things are terrible outcomes.
Yeah, I think it's a terrible it's like, we'll give you rape culture. That's, which would be a terrible outcome,
And so, like, I wish I knew what the perfect solution was. And this is one of the things that Nick and I keep trying to explore on our own show, which is, what are the solutions? We know what the long-term solution is when it comes to the education system. We know what the long-term solution is with Gen Alpha and with the parents who are currently raising them. You need to honestly, and it's controversial to say it, but like, you need to take your kids out of the public school system and stop allowing the state to indoctrinate them into a self-destructive worldview that's going to lead them into ruin. right? But the problem is that that's a 20-year solution.
Yeah.
And not everybody's going to follow it for varying different reasons. Either they don't agree with the solution, or they feel like they don't have the means to do so. And so it's not a perfect solution. It's a necessary but not sufficient way to fix the problem. But I mean, and we've had many conversations with young men that have been attracted to Nick's own message about responsibility and masculinity.
Yeah.
And so they tune into his shorts, they tune into his podcast, they join like his circle community, and they share stories that I can relate to very well, because I might be a little bit older than them, but I'm young enough to still relate to them in the sense that, like, I remember what it was like to be in high school. I remember what it was like to be in middle school. I certainly remember what it was like to be in college. I know what they're going through. And Nick is starting to understand what they're going through, even though he had a completely different life experience and worldview. He's kind of like a goal to aspire to, in the sense that he was able to make it, and he had a successful marriage, and he's had a successful family, and it turned out great for him. And together, again, one of the missions that we're trying to work on this podcast that we have is trying to figure out what are the solutions to those 18 to 29-year-olds that are having to live through this right now.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's going to be a single solution. I think that it's going to be a multifaceted one.
I don't. Yeah. And you know, Christian, I think you'll probably agree with me. Academia is a lost cause. That will never be fixed. And Harvard's got billions of dollars. You could stop giving money to Harvard for 50 years and Harvard would still be there.
Absolutely. Yes. And it's unfortunate, actually, because, like, and I say this as somebody who has a postgraduate degree. I have a master's degree.
Yeah.
And I went to university twice. And
you consider this as a career, and you realize, no, it's not for you, because you don't want to give into all this crap.
My father's a college professor. My whole life, until I met Nick, I wanted to become a college professor like my father, because I idolized the academic achievements of my father. And I can tell you right now, no, the university system is absolutely a lost cause. This is the reason why I stopped pursuing the dream of me getting a PhD and teaching history. That was what I wanted to do since I was literally 5 years old. I wanted to get a PhD in history and be a history professor, because I loved history. This was long before I cared about politics. And let me tell you, there's no saving Berkeley. There is no saving Harvard. Like these are institutions within academia that you're not going to salvage them. Like the idea, and I know some people that are like, well, why can't conservatives or libertarians do their own march through the institutions? Why can't we take the Duce Gramsci model and just march our way through the institutions just like the left did, starting in the 30s, right? And then eventually in 30 years, we're gonna have the same level of institutional control that the left now does, because conservatives and libertarians, by definition, do not have herd mentality. Yeah. And so it's easy to corral leftists, because the one thing that they have in common is that they're really good at following orders. They're not good at many other things. They just show everything they touch, but they'll follow orders. And so you can corral them in a way that allows you to march through the institutions. Corralling libertarians is like herding cats. Yeah. Do it. So you cannot do a march through the institutions for conservative values or libertarian values. And so that model, you just can't replicate it on the.
Do you think there's something about the nature of academia that just makes it amenable to makes it go this way? I mean, because this is not just an American problem. Have you read?
Like Thomas Sowell mentions that, like, part of the problem is that in academia, you're usually detached from the consequences of the ideas that you perpetuate.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know if you've ever read the Kaczynski Manifesto, which certainly talks about these things.
Yeah, he talks about it a little bit. I mean, Kaczynski also talks heavily about industrialization in general and technology, and I certainly don't agree with his proposed solutions. I think that he correctly identifies a lot of problems, but I don't necessarily agree with the solutions. But the whole academia thing, it is not a surprise that the left was able to hijack academia to the degree that they did, because academia deals almost exclusively in theory and theory alone. It does not necessarily deal in reality and consequences from the ideas from which emerge out of the academic tradition. In the real world, this is part of the reason why you see the right is more prominent within business, but even Wall Street and Silicon Valley got hijacked by the left as well.
Yes.
Because quite frankly, anything that is not explicitly right-wing will eventually become left-wing. There is no such thing as a neutral institution. They don't exist.
Yeah.
Eventually, institutions will either become hijacked by the left or they will perpetuate conservative values. One or the other. There is no middle ground where they're going to remain perpetually neutral in perpetuity. And so we should, but we should not be surprised that academia was the first thing to fall, in part because of the very nature of how academia operates. It operates exclusively in theory. It does not operate in reality. In fact, they can push a theory that has extremely self-destructive consequences, but they themselves do not have to experience the actual destruction of those consequences until much later.
Yeah.
So they pay no price for being wrong.
Yeah, I mean, do they understand if they destroy civilization, that's going to destroy the colleges too? It's like they don't seem to get that connection. It's rather odd. I don't know where. Yeah, I really don't know where we go from here. I don't know. I think also you do see some young women who realize that things are crazy and they want to go the other way too. I don't know if that's
there's a backlash that's happening across the board. It's happening more with young men than women, and we know why, for obvious reasons, because of the political implications, right? But like it's also happening with young women. It's just not happening to the same degree, in part because there's so many young women that have fallen into the modern day feminist woke intersectionality rabbit hole, and you're not going to pull them back. I mean, what's going to happen is that in the battle between delusional ideas and reality wins every single time. And it's only going to be when the consequences of that ideology actually manifest themselves that you're actually going to see a pushback. But I will say this: San Francisco is a perfect example of that ideology being applied without opposition. And we've seen the results of it.
Yeah.
Yet there has not yet been a massive right-wing backlash in San Francisco, right? It's not like San Francisco have all become a bunch of based, red-pilled conservatives overnight, right? And like that hasn't happened, which in some ways should tell you just how far, the clown car can go before it actually kind of, before the wheels start to fall off of it. Because if you can get San Francisco and you still don't have, this backlash from the right, well, then that tells you that, that means things are going to get a lot worse before they get better.
Yeah, I don't know, how, where things get worse before they get better. It's really interesting how, and we haven't even, where this goes from here. I don't know. Yeah. I've done a lot of shows, and the one thing that does give me hope right now is the rise of Javier Milei in Argentina.
He gives me a lot of hope because Argentina is the fiscal equivalent of what San Francisco is socially, right?
Yeah.
The country's destroyed. And they were also starting to go down the woke path, not to the degree of the United States, but like the government there had their Ministry of Women, Genders, and Diversity. They had a bunch of pro-trans stuff, a bunch of pro-LGBT stuff. They were pushing wokeism and intersectionality. It just wasn't as prominent as the complete fiscal collapse of the country, right?
Yeah.
Milei was able to get elected, and so far he's done some incredible stuff. He has got to I'm actually glad that you brought him up, Chris, because Javier Milei has got to succeed, because if he doesn't, if he fails, then at that point we're going to be, given a firsthand, example of, there is no voting your way out of this problem. And I don't think there's ever going to be a voting your way out of this problem. I think that ultimately solutions are going to come from individuals. But what it's going to do is that it's going to send the message that there is no democratic solution to this problem. And then at that point, the right is going to be presented with a choice where it's just bad outcomes no matter what. This is why I think there's a good chance. I don't think it's guaranteed, in part because Milei has pulled me back from the brink of the black pill abyss.
Yeah.
He got elected, because for a long time I thought that we're going to end up with a Caesar, where the right is going to decide, okay, we're just going to crush wokeism through authoritarian means, and we're going to become the villains that they already think we are. And then Milei got elected, and that gave me hope that, okay, that it's not guaranteed that will happen. He has got to succeed, because if he doesn't succeed, then the right is going to eventually conclude that there is no solution. It's just going to be a battle of brute force. And again, nobody wins in that case. It's just going to be a question of who loses more.
Yeah, I do want. Yeah, exactly. I don't. Yeah, and it's got to be. I mean, I've said sometimes it's the democratic capitalist equivalent of the Bolshevik Revolution, but it's where it goes from here. I don't know. I do know it's an amazing country. Comparing Buenos Aires to San Francisco, at least in Buenos Aires, I can still walk into a Starbucks and I might get a coffee. And if I want to use the bathroom, I just go use the bathroom. Whereas in San Francisco, I'm going to have to say, well, we got this number code you put in, and then you go to the bathroom. And to me, that to me is the sign that the city's gone to hell. Is when you have to get a key or something to go use the bathroom inside a business.
I think it's even worse than that. I mean, think about walking into the business. There's probably a person on the sidewalk shooting up heroin, on the streets, and there's feces everywhere and needles everywhere. And if you park your car to go into the coffee shop, the car's going to get broken into.
Yeah. It's like, is there any pride anymore? That's just sometimes what I wonder. If there's no pride, it's just.
So no, Chris, I totally agree. And like I said, like Milei has to succeed. If you are on the right, whatever your flavor is, we need to be rooting for this man to succeed, because if he doesn't succeed, then we don't have any sort of model for the direction that we need to go in order to prevent the societal and fiscal collapse that we know is happening. We haven't talked about that today, I know, because that's kind of outside the scope. But like, if you listen to Nick and I's podcast on making the argument, we've talked at length about the looming monetary disaster that awaits us, and the hyperinflation that will happen once debt monetization becomes the only mechanism through which the federal government will be able to fund its own budget deficits. And again, I mean, at that point, that the end result will be Argentina, right?
Yeah.
Or even worse, like Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe or something like that.
I do. We haven't talked about it either, but I do wonder how Bitcoin figures into all of this. And how does that impact the world? Because this is the alleged world reserve currency. I don't know where that goes.
And we also don't know when it'll happen, because you're talking about the world's largest. It's happened with smaller currencies, right? With smaller economies that are not the world's currency. It's never happened with it never happened with the British pound when that was the reserve currency, right? It's never happened with the German Deutschmark before World War I, when that was the secondary currency behind the British pound. It never happened, well, in part because Germany lost that war. But like, if you go back, you could argue that it happened to the Spanish peso, right? During the the pieces of eight, during the height of the Spanish Empire in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Like, you could argue that the complete destruction of the currency and hyperinflation and debt crisis, that did happen to the Spanish Empire, and that was part of the reason the Spanish Empire disintegrated. But it certainly didn't happen on a scale like you see today, where the United States is so integrated into the world economy and is so vital to the function of the world economy. And the dollar is the universal currency, whereas the peso was just the currency of the Americas and some parts of Europe, right? The dollar is used everywhere other than like North Korea, right? And so it's happening on a scale that is unprecedented. And if we go through a sovereign debt crisis in the United States, like I think that we will, I just can't tell you when. Because there's no will to cut spending in Washington, D.C., which means that debt will always have to be issued in order to fund the government. And what happens when nobody wants to buy the debt? Well, eventually the Federal Reserve will be forced to print the money to buy the debt. That's what debt monetization is. And that's where you get the fiscal equivalent of San Francisco. That's why I said that, like, it's Argentina is the fiscal example of a society collapsing. San Francisco is the social example of a society collapsing. Well, what happens when you get both of those, right? I mean, at that point, it's just pure warlordism, right? Isn't it? Like, I mean, maybe that's when the young men will come and save us all.
Maybe so, or I don't know where. It's definitely something that's really scary. I think you have to see where you're going. It's just amazing that And the American people can't say they weren't warned.
No, they were
That's what gets
warned
me.
for decades. But as I said earlier, H.L. Mencken did say that democracy is the belief that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard.
Yeah, I hope we can have an example of it. We've really never had an example of democracy fixing itself like this. I mean, maybe the examples of Central Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it's. And as I've told people, I said, I was 18 when the Berlin Wall came down. We didn't expect to be fighting this 35 years later, but we are.
Nick said the same thing. He was a bit younger. He was born in 79. And he says, he remembers watching the Berlin Wall fall down, and he thought this is an absolute win. Like, Marxism is dead, socialism is dead, capitalism is won, liberty has won, democracy is won. Yeah. And now we fast forward 30 years later, just over 30 years, and we see that no, Marxism did not lose. Marxism lost in the sense that there is no Iron Curtain and there is no Warsaw Pact, there is no Eastern Bloc, but cultural Marxism is the predominant quasi pseudo state religion at this point.
Yeah,
and socialism is the quasi pseudo state mechanism for fiscal policy at this point. And democracy is now the mechanism through which these things are implemented, or at least protected. And so, like, it's almost like, every single one of our reasons to be optimistic in 1989 are kind of falling by the wayside, which is part of the reason you're seeing so many people, especially that are a little bit older than me, that lived through this, are just wondering, like, where did we go wrong?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't know if some of these, and I am black pilled to a certain extent. I'm definitely black pilled about Russia and China. I said I don't think they'll ever be civilized, and maybe that's a harsh way to look at it, but it's, and I've even said maybe China will soon be the first country to genocide 100 million. It might. That's awful prediction to make, but that might happen.
I mean, I think Mao was pretty close to it already when we look at Mao's own track record. He might have killed like 60 million plus of his own people. But, like, I mean, China has with a very brief exception, about 100 years ago, right? China does not have a long tradition of, like, liberal democracy, right? The history of China, I believe it's the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, that the opening line in it is, the empire long united must divide, long divided must unite. And that is, if you know anything about Chinese history, that is Chinese history. Chinese history is a cycle of a dynasty coming to power, unifying what is a shattered China, establishing itself, going through a golden era, stagnating, declining, eventually falling, and then shattering China into pieces again for somebody to pick the pieces back up and repeat the cycle. And throughout all of that, it's always been an imperial process. In fact, you could argue it has continued to this present day. If you want to take the analogy even further, you could say that the CCP is today just another dynasty by a different name. And so China doesn't, and Russia likewise has no long tradition of democracy, has almost no tradition of democracy whatsoever to speak of. Now, I will say that you can still have civilization without democracy. It's just that it's not necessarily the type of civilization that we would, be familiar with in the West, because the West tradition really does stem from Rome and Greece, which, the Roman Republic and the different democracies of ancient Greece. And so, like, it's not that I don't necessarily think that like they can be civilized. It's that I don't think that democratic systems are intrinsically suited to work well within the different cultures and histories that those countries represent. And who knows, maybe it is possible to implement it, but it just hasn't obviously successfully been implemented so far. But I mean, I think they also have their own problems, right? Like, Russia has a stagnating population. They have drug abuse, alcohol abuse. Russia has a war in Ukraine that has no end in sight. I mean, but even absent of the war in Ukraine, like, Russia has so many of its own, like, cultural and societal problems where it's like the populace is basically spiritually dead. And China has a different problem in the sense that its population is collapsing. The CCP has destroyed its economy. The stock market in China is collapsing. They have the world's largest housing bubble. There's a debt bubble in China. that's waiting to implode. Everybody's quit on the whole message that the CCP has had, which is you must work really hard for the glory of China. Like there's whole movements of younger Chinese men that are like the lying flat and let it rot movements, where it's like they don't want to do anything now because what's the point? In part because there's also a gender imbalance. To go for full circle here, there's over 30 million more young men than young women in China.
Yeah.
What are they gonna do? Like, there's no hope for them to achieve anything because they won't have any chance to start their own family. So there's going to be no loyalty to the regime in China there, because why would there be? They don't get anything out of it. There's nothing for them to look forward to that's eternal. They might be able to like buy a house, but they're not going to be able to buy a family. And people are motivated far more by love of family than they are by love of material. Men will go through losing everything if it means saving their family or starting a family.
Yeah, that's the thing, and mothers will do that too, and that's the whole thing, and this is what gets me too, is, we're all going to have these old people who don't have anybody in their lives. So what happens, who takes away the car keys when they can't drive their car anymore and all this stuff. It's really, it should be a frightening prospect for anybody, and you see some older people who don't have families and like they kind of go crazy.
Well, I mean, one of the things that can predict an early death is not forming relationships and friendships when you're older. That's incredibly destructive, especially when you're in like your retirement years, not being able this is part of the reason why, like, I mean, most people that live to like 100, they have a very large family around them. Right. And so it's not just that they have like friends, they have families, they have, a ton of kids and a ton of grandkids and a ton of great grandkids. There's so many. I can't even, if I were to just try to sit here and list all the positive implications of pair bonding and family forming and marriage, it would be a 6-hour podcast, right? Like there's so many positive implications of this. And the tragedy behind all of it is that, like I said, we're going through this experiment that we've never conducted before, where people aren't forming those relationships anymore, and we're about to figure out where that's going to take us.
Yeah, I'm reminded of this tweet that Jeremy Kaufman put out once. He said, one of the great things about having a kid is it turns a lousy experience into a positive one. I got a flat tire, and then this suddenly became a lesson on cars and how all this stuff works.
Yeah,
because I had a kid, but and having a flat tire is a crappy experience. But then he said, but I got to teach my kids something today, so that was It just becomes a happy moment because you have a kid around. It's just, I thought that was a great attitude. And to me, that's one of the. I always tell parents, this is the whole point of social media, to brag about your kids.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's the dream of every parent.
Yeah.
For their kid or their children to eventually eclipse them.
Yes, as long as you don't say anything about their bathroom activities, but other than that, brag about your kids. It's like,
I don't want to like leave people super black. I know that we've talked about some depressing stuff, but I don't want to leave people just black-pilled here, because that's usually my job on Nick and I's podcast, because I'm the black-pilled one, and Nick will try to give the white pill. And so, like, I know that we've talked about some, distressing and arguably depressing stuff, but I will say that the silver lining, and I don't have all the answers, I don't have all the solutions. Part of the reason that I'm even on Nick's podcast is because I'm trying to find solutions just like a lot of other people are. And I have a unique opportunity to speak to Nick because we have this long friendship, and I've known him longer than most people have.
Yeah.
The one thing that I want to leave with your audience is that, like, I know that it's tempted to just take the black pill and be like, well, there's nothing to be done, I may as well just become a shut-in. And let me say, as somebody who is a shut-in, and I joke all the time on this podcast, I never leave my house. And it's something I got to work with. I will say this. The one silver lining that I do know for a fact is a silver lining, even though I don't have all the solutions and all the answers, is that you are not alone.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this and you're in that 18 to 29 age range, or even if you're in that 18 to, or, let's be a little bit broader, 16 to 35, if you're in that age range, and especially if you're a man, but even if you're a woman, just know that like you might feel isolated, you might feel alone, you might feel disconnected from society, you might feel like that you're missing out on what should be these like pivotal life moments, milestones, forming these relationships, dating, getting married, having kids, the things that your parents went through and that your grandparents certainly went through.
Yeah.
You might feel like you're missing out on those. But the one thing that you should know is that you are not alone in going through this. This is a very common problem. This is the whole reason Chris and I are having this conversation right now, because it's not just happening to one person. It's not just happening to a handful of people. It's not just happening to a small group of people on the internet. It's happening to almost every single person that's in that age bracket right now, with but the rarest of exceptions. And so the silver lining here is that you feel detached, you feel isolated, you feel alone. But in many respects, you're not, because you're not alone and feeling alone. And you're not alone in feeling single. And you're not alone in feeling lost and isolated. There's many other people that are going through that as well. And I don't think there's going to be a pure political solution to it. I don't think you're going to be able to vote your way out of this, social crisis of modernity that we're currently in. But I do think that we can begin to claw our way out of the hole that we're in by recognizing that we're not alone in this, and that other people are going through this as well. And that maybe through those shared experiences and hardships, you can start to form friendships. And then those friendships can become relationships, and those relationships can turn into dating prospects and marriage prospects. And maybe through that, we can slowly pivot our way back to getting on track to where I know that we all want us to be.
If I had a son at about 10 or 11, I'd probably try to teach him how to be a player. And while I wouldn't necessarily want him to sleep around, I would at least want him to have options. It's kind of like saying I don't want my son to be a player, but I want him to be able to be a player if he wants to be one, because I think that's the only way to go anymore. If you become a man that women respect.
Well, I mean, if I could like rephrase that,
yeah.
And this is something that Nick talked about in his podcast where we analyzed Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, because we've brought up that there's things that both of them have that men are incredibly attracted to. And then there's other things that you could argue are negatives. What Nick brought up, and he uses a different phrase, he calls it like the warrior poet. I just like to go full Plato, full Socrates, the philosopher king, right? Like that's what we really want. We want men to be philosopher kings. True. We don't want them to just be, bloodthirsty, barbarians, right? We don't want them to be warlords. Yeah. And we don't want them to be inept, where they're just academics, because we talked about earlier, like the direction that academia is going. And so one without the other is useless at best, and actually use kind of a little bit destructive at worst. And the other one is just raw rage and passion, and lacks any sort of sense of purpose or meaning, and is also self-destructive, right? You don't want to be a barbarian, and you also don't want to just be a raw academic.
Yeah.
And so combining those two, combining the Andrew Tates and the Jordan Petersons of the world in the form of somebody that is both physically and intellectually capable. Again, that's what the philosopher king is. Those are the people that, as the ancient Greeks wrote extensively about, as people like Plato tried to argue, those are the people that are best suited to rule. It's not the academics, and it's not just the generals. It's somebody that combines those two.
Yeah.
Because if you're just looking for a general, you're going to end up with Caracalla. And if you're just looking for an academic, bookish type, you're going to end up with a weakling that won't be able to command respect or authority and actually make it. Combining those two together in the form of that philosopher king is how you end up getting the type of man that is not just capable, but deserving of rule, capable and deserving of leadership. Those are the type of people that that society is attracted to. Those are the type of people that women are attracted to.
Yeah.
Those are the type of people that will lead us out of the abyss that we're currently staring at right now. And so combining those two together is I think kind of the path forward here. Nick calls it the warrior poet. I call it the philosopher king.
Yeah.
It's the same thing though in principle.
Well, there was that one book, that's called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, which I think maybe you put all those things together. It's like, these 4 archetypes of men. It's yeah, I don't know where, it's, I don't know. I don't know how we get there. Because it doesn't seem like I also, maybe, there's something, as Jordan Peterson likes to say, is that maybe the sane women will stand up and start to control the insane women, because I think the insane women are a minority.
I think that they're a very, very loud and vocal minority.
Yeah.
Sane women have better things to do with their lives than screech on Twitter and the internet and Reddit and attend rallies and protests, right? They have better things to do. Same thing with sane men for that matter. But I honestly, though, I think I disagree with Peterson there. I do not think that, and maybe people will take this the wrong way, but like I don't think that women, even sane women, are actually going to be the ones that are going to lead us out of it, in part because it's usually not women that lead these mass social movements for towards revival. It's usually men that do it and that shine a light for the direction that things need to go, and then everybody else follows, men and women for that matter. It's usually a small segment of men, like I said, I'll call it the philosopher kings, that illuminate the path forward, and everybody else follows them. Again, I don't mean it in a strongman sense. I mean it in a leadership sense.
Yeah. But I also sometimes wonder if our society wants to have real leaders, and they just would rather rally around demagogues. And that's the problem. And that's another.
Well, I mean, right now they certainly do. But again, in the battle between delusional ideas and reality wins every single time. So people will keep voting for demagogues until eventually the demagoguery results in San Francisco and Argentina everywhere, right? And then that's when hopefully we'll get an opportunity to get a Malay. Because Malay, in many respects, embodies that philosopher king mentality.
Yeah, he does.
Question. He understands economics. He's not some sort of rube that is just a demagogue. He understands economics, and he's obviously a capable leader in the sense that he was able to turn what was originally considered a fringe political movement, and he won the largest landslide election in Argentina's political history. He led a revolution basically and overthrew an institutionalized system that had destroyed that country. And so like he potentially, the jury's still out. We don't know how it'll play out, but he's potentially that type of philosopher king that I was trying to hint at earlier.
Yeah, and maybe that could be a model for the rest of the world. I in general am pretty optimistic about South America, because South America seems like, on the gender thing, it seems like South America is about where maybe America was in the 1950s. Although I'm seeing signs that it's getting bad down there too, where you can still build and have families and maybe create some prosperity. Because I do consider that part of the West. I mean, they're all descendants of the Roman Empire. It's just like most of us in the West are. But and maybe it'll go there, and and maybe they'll be, because I think Europe is. I think Western Europe is completely and totally a lost cause, worse off than America. And I would probably say the same thing about most of the English-speaking countries now too. Because maybe America's better off than I can't think of any English-speaking country that's better off than America is. Maybe.
Oh, I can't think of any country that's better off than America at the moment. I mean, we were talking about China and Russia and Europe, and like I was just in the UK 2 months ago, and the UK has some big problems, some big problems on its hands. I was also in the Netherlands 2 months ago, and they also have some big problems on their hands, which is part of the reason they're going through some political upheaval right now. I mean, a lot of European countries are. The United States is geopolitically, demographically, socially, culturally, and economically, for all of our faults on all of those things, better off positioned on each of those categories than almost any other country in the Western world.
Yeah, we are. Well,
every single country in the Western world. I do not envy. I would pit the United States up against Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, Russia, China, the vast majority, Mexico, the Americas, like I mean, let alone, you know, Southeast Asia, and in Africa. I mean, and also to that matter, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea as well, which are other highly developed, highly rich countries. They also have big problems. I think that Japan has culturally a way better set of cards than we do, but they have some other big problems demographically that we don't quite have because they're way further along in this whole complete collapse in birth rates type of situation than the United States is. It's getting worse, but in Japan, I mean, it's their population shrinking just like South Korea, just like Taiwan.
Yeah. Birth rates haven't completely collapsed in South America, although they might get there pretty soon.
Yeah.
That's why I still have some hope there. You know,
I do think it's going to take quite a long time to fix the birth rate problem. I don't think that's going to be a quick fix. Honestly, that might take like a century or more to fix. The good news is that there will always be an opportunity to fix it. The world might lose 1 billion people long term through just low population, you know, low birth rate numbers, right? Because we're getting close to a point where the world will stop growing because birth rates are collapsing pretty much everywhere at this point. Like Africa is still very high, but everywhere else it's collapsing. I mean, in Europe it's negative. If it weren't for mass immigration, they'd be Japan, it's shrinking. South Korea is shrinking. Taiwan is shrinking. China is shrinking. In the United States, it would be shrinking if it weren't for immigration. And there's something to be said about the damage of mass migration and how that's not a long-term solution to falling birth rates, right? Just replacing the current people living in a place with the new people just moving in is not a long-term way. That's certainly not how you're going to preserve like a set of social values and cultures. Just ask the Romans, right? Like that's part of the reason the Roman Empire collapsed in the West in the 5th century was because you had mass migration of Germans across the Rhine and Danube rivers. And Rome did not survive that, right? And so immigration is not going to be a solution to falling birth rates. That's going to be a temporary way to avert the consequences of falling birth rates. But long term, that's actually damaging to simply say immigration will be our solution to falling birth rates. That is not a sustainable problem, and that's going to create a bunch of social issues too. So I don't know what's exactly going to fix it, and I don't know how long it will take to fix it. But even if it takes a century or longer, it can be fixed. And like I said, I think that solution is going to come probably more from individuals than politicians.
Yeah, it could be interesting. Well, this has been a good talk. I think it's probably a good time to sign off. So, yeah, you got anything else to say before we go? We got a website out there or anything like that? We got.
I mean, myself, yeah, sure. You could check out my Twitter account, or sorry, X account. You know, it's just my name. It's just Christian. You know, at Christian Heiens. Heiens is spelled Heiens. It's weird.
Yeah.
I got 3 vowels in a row, but yeah, I mean, I'm pretty active on there. But other than that, I mean, the best way to tune into me would be to look at the Making the Argument podcast with Nick Freitas. I got my mug here.
Yeah. Yeah, making some mugs. Yeah, you guys got a good show there out there. There's some good conversations. Yeah, Nick's a smart guy. Yeah, he's an articulate speaker. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah,
well, Chris, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pretty awesome conversation.
Yeah, it's been pretty awesome too, Christian. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Well, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. I'm Chris Baker, and we're out.